Hey there, welcome back to the Springs in the Desert podcast. I am Jillian, your host, and I am joined once again by the lovely Claire Kane. How are you doing, Claire?
I'm well, thanks, Jillian. Thanks so much for having me back.
Yes, I am honored. It's a privilege to have you here on the podcast. And I'm really grateful that you are here for this conversation. Listeners, I typically give the disclaimer if there is one to give, but I think that Claire and her wisdom and her profession is much better poised to say the disclaimer today. So, Claire, I will just hand it off to you to do that.
Oh, sure. Well, thanks so much, Jillian. So today we're going to be talking about supporting those experiencing infidelity in a season of infertility, which is really, let's just call it what it is, double whammy. And for those listeners out there who are, for whom this is part of your experience, just know that you have all of my empathy, all of the empathy and compassion of all of the team, that we're here for you to be a support. And at the same time, that this podcast is not treatment. It is not mental health treatment. It is meant to be for informational purposes only. And if this is your struggle right now, if you're listening to this podcast and you are finding big emotions coming up, I would really encourage you to pause it, take a break from it. If you feel it's important, continue to listen. But if you don't listen to anything beyond these 15 seconds, that's really okay. I would say that to head off our conversation, funnily enough, my suggestion is this as a clinician, is that infidelity is one of those sufferings where the question is not, do I need professional mental health support? The question is, how soon can I get that appointment for myself? Because this is a real suffering, and you need support through it. If you have friends and family who are supporting you, that is amazing and wonderful, but I really cannot recommend highly enough that you seek support, because often the healing process from infidelity is long. It's involved. It involves two freedoms, hopefully working together and coming together again. But that is a process. And so in the interim, you need support and a space to grieve and feel all your feelings. And I really highly recommend you seek out a mental health professional. And Springs in the Desert has wonderful professional contributors, friends of the ministry who would be happy to connect with you and or point you to resources in your community.
Yes, that's right. We'll make sure we have a page dedicated to that if you want to look around yourself to see if someone's near you, but also please feel free to reach out and we can help connect you as well. Thank you so much for that, Claire. This is an important topic, as you said, but also a difficult one. But my prayer and my hope and I have confidence that this conversation will be one of hope and one of goodness, because we believe that God is healer and redeemer, and so we're gonna talk about the hard things, but entrust all of it to Him. And so, Claire, I'm wondering if we might be able to frame this conversation sort of with the many sort of shapes that, or the many sort of ways that we might be talking about infidelity, and maybe not even sort of the act of unfaithfulness, but what might be some struggles that could be umbrellaed kind of under this that a couple might be experiencing in their marriage.
That's an excellent question, because I think sometimes what can happen, there can be an assumption for those who are experiencing this double grief, right? You're experiencing infertility, and in your marriage, you are also experiencing infidelity. That there is a causative relationship between those two. And I just really want to sort of bust that myth, because that, there is a correlation between the two, right? That both are happening at the same time. And that's not, it is not uncommon to the point of vanishing rarity, but it is kind of not the norm. And I say that because infidelity often arises in relationships where some sort of suffering that affects both parties has just like come onto the scene in the marriage, whether it's occupational, financial, relational, in the sense of like difficult people in the family, right? Some great suffering that affects both members has kind of often comes into a relationship. Circumstances happen, and it kind of brings fissures that were present in the couple's emotional, sometimes physical intimacy, but usually first emotional intimacy and connection. It brings fissures, cracks that were there, kind of glaringly into the light. It's basically like sort of it's like shines a spotlight onto something that was already there. And I say this really to kind of alleviate what may be some worry on the part of listeners for whom infidelity is not part of their marriage experience, that somehow there's a causative relationship and now I have to worry about my spouse being unfaithful too. Thanks a lot, Claire. Like I don't have enough going on. Okay. And I just really wanted to sort of take that off the table. Every couple is going to experience suffering. It's the way the world works. The way that we are, the way that we have to live in the world will mean that suffering and circumstances beyond our control will hit us. The question becomes, how do we address and hopefully speak healing to individuals and the couple themselves who have experienced this? And then how do we support couples for whom maybe disconnection is growing so that this doesn't end up happening, right? That the sort of like end result just does not happen because the fissures are healed earlier.
I always appreciate how you frame things, because that it's just so true, right? We everyone listening could likely identify, yes, we've had this suffering in our marriage, and this suffering, we've all had something. And whether, like I loved those examples, occupational, financial, there's so many larger sufferings that could bring those others to the
Yeah.
surface. And so I appreciate that, because if we're able to notice, I love how you use that word often. If you're able to notice and recognize what's happening, you can be more equipped to work
Yes.
together as a couple and handle that. And I'm I'm wondering, right, the evil one likes to take the truth and distort it and then
Mm-hmm.
present that to us as this more sort of appetizing or easier or fill in the blank, sort of to our heart. And
Mm-hmm.
what what would you say is the truth that the evil one is distorting and enticing, sort of unfaithfulness,
Mm-hmm.
or the desire, or even the we'll get into this, I think, a little bit more in just a minute, but the idea that if I had made different choices in my past, or if I had
Mm.
married someone else,
Yes.
what's that truth that the evil one is distorting in all of these sort of forms of dissatisfaction?
That's a really good question. Well, I think it's the shoulding, right? I should have chosen this. If only I had this, right? I think sometimes, we, we spend a lot of time in our pasts or in our futures and very little, I think, in the present. It's easier.
Mm,
It's fleeing the present. It's sort of, I feel like the effects of the fall, right? Is really truly like not
yes.
living in the moment. And so I think sometimes we can idealize in moments of maybe suffering or strife in our marriage, where something clearly is, um, some disconnection is happening. Usually, again, with emotionally first, some disconnection is happening. We can start to idealize maybe past relationships we've had. Sometimes we idealize new friendships that are growing, maybe with someone of the opposite sex, and that idealization is not actual emotional connection. It's sort of like a pseudo connection, right? And, to speak to what happens in temptation, is a distortion, right? It's a pseudo, it's a hologram, and often an inverse hologram, right? I'm looking for greater emotional availability and emotional intimacy. And it's easier to think about that with an idealized person who's not actually real from my past. Now it's a memory that I'm idealizing. Or it's easier to think about being, kind of idealizing and being in an emotional relationship with somebody else, like an intense emotional intimacy with someone else than my spouse, because it's painful, which is so interesting because you're actually fleeing emotional intimacy, right? There's a deep irony there. I'm fleeing
Yeah.
emotional intimacy because this other emotional intimacy looks a hell of a lot easier in the moment, right?
Mm.
So I was, discussing this a little bit, this upcoming talk, and thinking about it with the wonderful Anne Kashut,
Mhm.
one of the mamas of the ministry. And I was saying, in my marriage, so my husband and I have been married for a long time, very happily. I adore this man, and I delight in his adoration of me. So he is wonderful. And the first years of our marriage, we used to talk occasionally about the cardboard spouse. So it still comes up. Just want to normalize it still comes up. Like, I think there are moments when you marry someone, right, after you're married a little bit, and you come to the reality of the person, often when they're like super frustrating or like stinky, or like they have some sort of reaction to something, and you're like, really? Right? Really? Right? And I said to him, like, we talked about the cardboard spouse. There's this moment where you are literally presented with the reality of the person you have married. And then
Wow.
there is a cardboard cutout over here of like, pick your person, right? Like a former boyfriend, some idealized person, Mr. Darcy from the Pride and Prejudice, whoever. Okay. My preference would be Mr. Knightley, right? All right. And there's this moment where you're like, I either choose to love the person I have covenanted with,
Mm.
or I put all my time and attention into judging him in reference to that. I
Wow.
resent him for not being that. And that's the moment where you like pick up the cardboard spouse and chuck it on the fire. Like, that's the moment. Disclaimer here, I am not talking about abusive relationships. I'm not talking about physical, sexual, psychological, or verbal abuse. There are relationships in which one spouse is abusive toward the other, or both spouses are abusive towards each other. That is a separate issue. I'm talking about the general difficulty of living with another freedom in emotional intimacy for the rest of your life. And there are going to be moments where you're like, I think Jim Gaffigan has a great bit about this. He's like, in the happiest marriage, there comes moments where you're like, oh, I've made a terrible mistake. Right? which always gets a great laugh because it's true. You're like, this is the person. Do I invest my time, attention, and emotional energy in longing for him or her to be someone else? Or do I just love the person that I have and I chose? Do I lean in? And let me tell you, those moments of leaning in, small, large, humorous, challenging, like, have nothing but good fruit come from them.
Listeners, if you don't know what just happened, I dropped my mic for Claire because that was extraordinary. Wow. I mean, what you just said is so helpful to every marriage, right? That we're faced with this choice every day.
Yes.
Do I love my spouse who has weaknesses, who has
Yeah.
strengths, who likes things I like to do and likes things I really don't like to do and does things differently than I would do them, but still gets the job done. And, you know,
Yes.
all of these quirks and beautiful things. And that's so, so helpful. And I think helpful in this conversation about
Yep.
infidelity
Yes.
as well,
Yep.
because I think you covered so many, right? There is this the evil one, right, distorted. It is, all of it is just so ironic because he is not clever. He's just not clever. He has only a couple of tricks up his sleeve, but because we are human and he knows how to distort them in a way that speaks to us right quickly. And right, especially we're in this sort of culture of instant gratification, and as you said, like, I have this really intense intimacy that could be available to me, but there's also this one that feels quicker and more enticing, for all sorts of reasons. That's I just really appreciate how you framed that. And I think it's also helpful to maybe I want to maybe speak to the spouse
Yeah.
who well, I want to speak to both of them. We will.
Yeah.
But if your spouse has been unfaithful to you,
Yeah.
Claire, what would you say to that spouse again, generally, not with specifics, and but how can they, right, with everything we just said, right, and knowing or creating the image and likeness of God, like how do we sort of open our heart to begin finding healing, or begin
Mm.
that conversation? How do we, knowing this news, or again, just feeling like maybe in my own heart, if I had married someone else, or if my spouse had married someone else, they would be happier, right? Coming back to my marriage, to this reality, to this sacrament, to these vows, what what sort of mindset, mind sort of
Mm.
frame can I put myself in to have a conversation to begin finding healing?
Okay. So I think the conversation the conversation to start the healing process is between the spouse and his or herself, and then the spouse and his or herself with God. Does that make sense? And like, it's an interior conversation, like the two parts of original solitude, you talking with you and you talking with the Lord, in a sense, and I say this not to be doom and gloom. Okay. And I think part of as I was, thinking through talking about this topic, it's a hard one to talk about because healing and recovering, a couple recovering from infidelity, is a lot of work, and it is good work, and it is beautiful work, and it is the responsibility of both parties. And that, when I say that, like, if you are, shall we say, the injured spouse, the spouse against whom faith has been broken, okay, it's important you start talking with you. And the first thing is, it is not your job to fix this. It's not your job. Okay. Because I think sometimes there is an assumption that something that's gone wrong, I have to fix it. I have to make it right. I have to preserve the sacrament. I have to do this. It's like, okay, if there was only one freedom involved in this, sure, have at it. That's you. But there are two freedoms. There are two. Okay. And I think that's one of the things that's really important to remember, is that you can only do what you can do. Okay. So that first conversation with yourself is to sort of be like, these things happened. How do I feel about that? What am I feeling? Talking with the Lord, I'm regretting all this stuff. I'm feeling all these feelings. And, I know we've talked about this in previous podcasts, but, especially when it comes to this kind of suffering, right? Where faith has been broken, and there's such a sense, a legitimate, real, definitive sense of betrayal, right? I think sometimes as Christians, we allow ourselves so few emotions, especially the challenging ones of anger and rage and disbelief and intense betrayal. Those are reasonable things to feel, right? And not that, like, a feeling doesn't have a moral quality. It is not good or bad because it doesn't have a will, right? It just comes, and then it can go. Or it can stay for a bit because it's important. It's trying to give you a piece of information about something that went down or something that's important to reflect on, right? So those feelings that you're feeling are real, they are reasonable, and they're important. They don't necessarily mean you need to take action now, because something that can happen when a marriage is in crisis, often there's this, we have to make decisions now. Like, that's what anxiety can do, is it creates sometimes a false sense of urgency. Sometimes it's a real sense of urgency. Like, again, to refer to, this is beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but like issues of safety, of personal safety, sexual safety, physical safety. We're not talking about those things. We're talking about giving yourself time. Okay. Giving yourself time. The process of mending can't start until you have encountered your heart in this moment. It can't start. You can't just leap to healing, because we just want to book it to the resurrection. And for those of you who are in the garden right now of this, just know that my heart is with you. You have all of my empathy and compassion, because this is a very, very terrible place to be. It is not the end of the story. It is 100% not the end of the story. Unfortunately, neither Cassandra or I, unless she surprises me greatly, has the gift of foreknowledge. So I have no idea, if you're listening to this, how your particular story is going to turn out. But we know that we have a God of hope, and that what you can do in the moment is do your best to be present to yourself and let the Lord be present to you. And that will set the tone for whatever direction healing is going to take for you.
Mm.
Whether that's a restoration of a marriage, whether that's a separation, whether that's a divorce. I don't know. That's for
Mhm.
you and the Lord to determine.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a beautiful foundation. Beautiful. I love that the conversation with me and me and me and God to start there, because I can definitely see the situations where you just want to like book it, like you said, to the resurrection, and just get it all out. And I'm having this conversation because perhaps my emotions are sort of bringing me to that height, but to just feel them
Yeah.
and recognize and bring them to God and to counseling. And um, yeah, I appreciate that. And I am wondering if you have any thoughts about what you would say to the spouse who has been unfaithful,
Yeah.
and particularly, right, the spouse who is desiring reconciliation, who is
Yeah.
desiring to restore and heal
Yeah.
their relationship. Where where would you tell them to begin? And maybe it's the
Mm,
same place.
it's the exact same place. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yourself and yourself and yourself and the Lord. Begin in original solitude, right? And that there is a reciprocal discomfort in being in that place, right? Like having to sit with the gravity of the choice that this person made, that you made, and that the gravity of the consequence for family life and all those. There's a lot there to unpack, And to that person, I would also say you need to make an appointment with a counselor, whether
Mhm.
it's a psychologist, a social worker, a licensed mental health professional, like whoever you find someone you feel you can be honest with, someone that you make an emotional connection with, so that you can start to parse through why this happened, why you made these choices. I think the other thing too is, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say this, because I've seen it in clinical practice a lot. The person who sets the schedule for the healing is the injured party, because sometimes the person who has injured, who has been, who has been unfaithful, gets weary of being sorry for it, um, and starts to resent the time that it's taking to rebuild trust. Um, and to that person, I would say, I hear you, and you forfeited that, right? I would be real serious and be like, yeah, nobody gets to decide anybody else's healing time frame. I mean, I don't get to
Mhm.
decide it for my clients. I don't get to, in a sense, like the only person I get to decide it for myself is me, right?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
you can't decide your spouse's time frame for healing if that's something that you're working toward. Okay. So I would say those things, but it's really important that you have support, because there are reasons why people make this choice. Often they're rooted in fear of intimacy. Funnily enough, very much often rooted in fear of intimacy. Sometimes they're rooted in trauma, and sometimes they're rooted in all different kinds of things. And parsing that out is important for healing. Personally, whatever happens in the marriage, whatever happens, it's important for you, if this is your story, if you have made this choice, to know that mercy is yours too,
Mm. Mhm.
always. Um, from the Lord, your mercy is yours. And it's going to take a lot of work, but it's worth it. And again, don't know what shape that healing is going to take. Don't know,
Mhm.
but it's going to be worth it. Um, yeah. So I think those are the things I would say.
Yeah. So Claire, if a couple is on the same page. They've been talking to themselves. They've been bringing this to prayer. They've been getting, whether that's individual or couples counseling, or maybe both, or
Yeah.
whatever shape that has taken. And they've decided they want to move forward in healing together and restoring their marriage. What might be some boundaries
Hmm.
or some helpful like parameters perhaps that a couple could, or maybe even benchmarks, or I'm not quite exactly sure
Yeah.
what word that would be, but that a couple could put in place to help them along this journey.
Okay. I think I think it really varies by couple, right? Each couple is
Sure.
going to need some different way of taking the temperature of their connection. Does that make sense? It's like, how are we connecting? Um, I'm thinking of those like meters that you use. I'm not handy at all, so someone will know what this is. Like the meter you use to test the electrical outlet. Like, is it safe or is it like gonna blow? Does that make sense? Like, right? Like, are we in the green or like we in the red? Right? I think like not that that has to be done every day, but it has to be done with serious regularity, checking in with each other. How are you doing? How are we thinking? And that's where a counselor, a couples counselor, can be enormously helpful for sort of providing interventions where that is going to become a part that builds intimacy, not as some sort of like, oh, wearying to do. Does that make sense? Like, but like,
Yeah.
this is part of building intimacy, checking in with each other, making each other a priority in ways that the other person, needs. So yeah, I think those can be really helpful. And the other disclaimer and put on this, not something we've really talked about, even though, we are talking about infidelity in a season of infertility. From my clinical perspective on this would be, in general, if infidelity is part of your experience, I would put attempts to conceive way on the back burner here, because it is desperately problematic to try to bring a child into a couple who is experiencing this level of disconnection, and whose marriage is really in grave danger. So that is just, I would say, a benchmark is,
Hmm.
if this is your experience, that is sort of off the table for a while until you each determine, and then determine together, whether you're both in it to heal. Um,
Hmm.
and I understand that for especially the injured party, that is like a triple suffering. So please know that you have my empathy in that. But I promise you, and it has to be said, a baby is not going to fix this. It's going to make it much worse. Okay. Having a child and bringing it into this kind of level of disconnection is going to make it just much worse. And I say this not to be the voice of gloom and doom, but to sort of be really honest and hopefully prevent more suffering for yourself, your spouse, and or the little one you bring into this.
Mhm.
Yeah.
No, I think everything you're saying, it's so important to say, and I am grateful for this space to be able to say these things lovingly,
Yeah.
and truly lovingly, for the
Yeah.
love of the couple and the sacrament of marriage and the possibility of healing in
Yeah.
whatever shape that takes. That it's there are analogies that are sort of running through my head that fall completely short of this conversation, but it was explained to me. I don't know if exactly where it was that I heard this. I don't know if it was a like sort of marriage seminar or something that I was at, but if you have a broken limb, right, like you have to like address that and heal that and help bring that to function before you can go run that marathon. And
Yes.
you won't be successful in running that, or meeting your goals in that, or doing it well, if you're injured and you're still hurting, and there's you won't be able to run to the capacity you were hoping for. Or and Of course there's many ways that fall short of this, but I think in a similar way, that if you're able to, as a couple, look notice, pay attention, and work together on this aspect, those other things will fall into place as they are supposed to
Mhm.
in the future. But so I appreciate that, Claire, and grateful for your loving attention to that. I'm wondering, to sort of circle back to something we talked about at the beginning. Now, this episode is about infidelity and right this the act of unfaithfulness, but we have heard from many in our community, Claire, about a few different ways that this might come into their heart or exist in their heart. And we've heard from those who, as we've shared a little bit, who wish that their spouse could be married to someone else so their spouse could be sort of happier, quote unquote, and could have the children that they were hoping to, or vice versa, that they could have married themselves someone different and perhaps could have had the family that they had been dreaming of and desiring their whole life. Or there's also those who are sort of confused or recognize some maybe inappropriate attachments to those of the opposite sex, friends or colleagues, things like that, who are perhaps either able to spend time with and for whatever reason are developing these attachments. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for someone in this kind of situation where the sort of an act of unfaithfulness hasn't occurred, but these kind of thoughts and feelings and desires are sort of stirring in someone's heart.
Sure.
And how can we, right? Because, right, in a season of infertility, it's often so isolating. And so when you
Yeah.
found a friend or you found a community, it's an answer to a prayer. And now, if you're noticing that there's some unhealthy friendships forming or attachments forming, what would you maybe say to someone to make sure that they are safeguarding
Yep.
themselves and their marriage?
Okay. That's an excellent question. I think I would say first be compassionate with yourself. Okay. Because when we're suffering, our guard is down, right? And you know, taking a pause, kind of taking a breath, if we're noticing these thoughts before we leap to judgment, just again noticing brain, hey, I'm noticing I'm thinking about that a lot, or I'm noticing I'm seeming to like feel more connected to this person than I am to my spouse. Okay, that's just a piece of data right now. I don't have to castigate myself for it, right?
Mm.
If I choose, knowing that, to sort of put a lot of time and attention and to sort of like try to nourish, cultivate, and grow that relationship in a way that's unhealthy, that we've crossed a border, right, into sort of emotional infidelity, right? But I think just noticing, like, hey, I'm mourning opportunities that I chose not to take, or I'm wishing so much that my spouse had like married someone else so that they could have, right? Like just as you said, right? You know, those really common thoughts. I just want to normalize that for people. It's really common to have those thoughts, to wonder what if, right? The question then becomes, am I spending a lot of time? Am I watching that what if just drift by? Or am I laser focused on it and now putting a lot of time and attention to sort of like extrapolating, right? That's when I would be like, okay, that's maybe not as helpful, because I notice myself feeling more irritable with my spouse, or I notice myself less inclined to be, I'm now comparing, right? I think that is really important, is to sort of notice when maybe a habit of comparison has crept in, right? Um, and to sort of be a little bit more mindful about taking that person out of the mental equation, being like, that person was who they are. And they were part of my life in the past. They are no longer part of my life. And investing my time, attention, and emotional energy in thinking about, seeking out, that is not going to be helpful. If it's someone that you found in a community and this friendship is growing, I'd say just like, take your emotional temperature. Do I seem to be getting more pleasure and intimacy, emotional intimacy with this person than my spouse? Then I'd be like, something is a little disordered here. I'm going to pull back, or I'm going to basically make spending time with my spouse a priority. That doesn't mean you can't see the other person, but it's basically just sort of like a harnessing of your time and attention, right? Again, these emotions are going to come, thoughts are going to come. And again, especially in a season of suffering like infertility, they're probably some of them might be intrusive. Like, why do I find myself always thinking about this person? The thought of the person is not the problem. It's the entertaining of the thought, right? Right. And the sort of like extrapolating on that and spending a lot of time and attention and emotional energy. So that's what I would say, is just basically take your emotional temperature, notice without judging, be compassionate with yourself, and make changes as you need to sort of the level of intimacy you have with other people who are not your spouse.
Claire, thank you for that and for everything that you have shared in this episode. Listeners, I just want to echo what Claire said at the beginning of this episode, that if you are finding yourself in this situation, we would be so happy to connect you with someone who can help you and or your spouse work through this. We have many professional contributors and and friends of the ministry who would be happy to support you in this season. Before we wrap up, Claire, is there anything else that you would like to say on this topic, or to couples perhaps in carrying this particular cross?
Well, I think I would say that, we live in a culture where it is work to combat habits of disconnection. It is work to do that. Okay. And that is normal. For it to feel effortful sometimes is going to feel normal. Sometimes it's like you and your spouse are paddling a canoe, right? You're in a canoe together. Everybody's on the canoe. It's a bigger canoe, right? I've only canoed once in my life, so I don't know how big most canoes are. But the two of you are in it. Everybody's got a paddle. There are going to be seasons in your life where you are paddling seamlessly. There are going to be seasons in your life where you're spinning because someone is like off stroke, right? There are going to be seasons in your life where you both are paddling hard and your hands are blistered. There are going to be seasons like that. Okay, so the work of marriage and the work of marriages who are in, shall we say, visible distress, the work of marriages who are maybe staving off distress successfully in a season, is because they are putting in the work and habits of connection. And those can be literally as simple as a 10-second intentional hug, morning and night. Praying for each other. I think I talked about this in another podcast, like saying a prayer in the morning for 5 seconds, saying a prayer together in the evening for 5 seconds, checking in with each other once or twice a day, finding something that works for you to sort of remind yourself, mind and body, that you are a unit. Two separate people, 100%, but who are joined together for a common purpose here. So those habits of connection can be enormously helpful at preventing damage and healing damage.
Thank you for that. I think, again, every couple could benefit from that suggestion, and particularly those who are struggling with unfaithfulness in some way in their marriage. Listeners, just know that the whole team is praying for you, especially if this episode is one that you're finding yourself experiencing in your marriage. And we know how hard this is, and as Claire said, we empathize with you, and we we're here for you. We're here to walk with you however we can, and so please reach out to the team if you need anything. And we'll see you next time on the podcast. Thanks so much for being here.